It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to what is, for the US Studies Center, the end of a long and winding road following the US election. Tonight we get a chance to hear what it might all mean for the US, for Australia and the world, and it's going to be my great pleasure to sit in on the panel with some extraordinarily distinguished people. Leigh Sales, as many of you know, anchors Lateline more than half-time. She was previously ABC TV's national security correspondent, and before that Washington correspondent, and earlier on she had a radio career at the ABC National Radio, including important coverage of the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. She has won the Walkley Award for her reporting on Guantanamo Bay, and she's also been a finalist for that award for other reporting, including, I noticed, her coverage of Hurricane Katrina for the ABC. She's also an award-winning author, having written the book Detainee 002, about the detention of David Hicks at Guantanamo Bay. In my reverse alphabetical order, the second person that I'll introduce is Michael Parks, who's sitting on my far left at the moment. Michael is the former director of the USC Annenberg School for Journalism in Los Angeles, and also a former editor of the Los Angeles Times. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1987 for his coverage of what turned out to be the last days of apartheid in South Africa. But Michael has more than 25 years' experience as a bureau chief for both the Baltimore Sun and the Los Angeles Times in most of the world's major capitals and hotspots. This is Michael's first trip to Australia, and several people, including myself, asked him why, and his answer was, well, there hasn't been a revolution or a war in Australia anytime recently. Last but certainly not least, the most recent guest of the US Studies Center in Australia is David Brady. David is the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford in Northern California. He's also a professor in the business school and the political science department. And I have to be really nice to him because he was on an academic committee that hired me 20 years ago when I got a job at Stanford. So please be nice to David too. He is, for his sins, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the highest honor that can go to social scientists in the US. And I'm going to sit way over there on the far left, which tells you nothing about my politics, I'm sure, particularly since you're in the audience, it looks like the far right. I like to be ambiguous on these things. What I'm going to do now is cede control of proceedings to Leigh Sales. Leigh?
So does that position me on the far left of politics or the far right?
As I said, it all depends on how you look at it.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Let's start broadly. Michael Parks, why did Obama win?
I think, and this, I'll give it to you in one sentence, people voted for hope, they voted for vision, and they voted for change. I think David may have a more elaborate response, but the economy in the United States has collapsed. I'm somewhat overstating it, and I've been called an alarmist. But every day back in Pasadena, where I live, I meet people who've lost their jobs. At least one person a day. Around Los Angeles, there are suburbs that are being depopulated because people can't afford their mortgages. When this reality sunk in late September, early October, I think the election was either lost by John McCain or won by Barack Obama.
David, what's your take?
I have an even simpler explanation. He wasn't George Bush. So I don't disagree with any of that. Election, actually, the models we work off of, Senator Obama should have been winning earlier by 8 to 10 points. And it really wasn't until the economic crisis hit and Senator McCain sort of shut the campaign down and I won't debate. And our poll showed that he dropped about 6 to 8 points at that point, and he was never able to recover. So I don't disagree with what you said.
Was there anything that McCain could have done?
Well, first of all, I think on the whole he ran a pretty good campaign. And as I said this afternoon, much of the people don't agree, but for 10 days, Sarah Palin was a really pretty good choice in that she kept Obama's speech out of the news. The base of the Republican Party, which is pretty conservative and religious, were very happy with her, and it allowed McCain to say, go back to his theme about, look, I work cross-partisan, I'm a maverick, which he hadn't been able to do before. And so he could have, when the economy hit, not behaved so John McCain-like, shoot from the hip, and been a little bit more withdrawn, be more like Obama and say, I'm not going to introduce presidential politics into this. But he didn't do it, and at the same day that the market was falling apart by 500 points, he said he thought the fundamentals of the American economy were in pretty good shape. And Senator Obama had such a terrific campaign. All of the advertising was done in-house, and they took that was at 10 o'clock in the morning in Chicago, and by 1 p.m. in the afternoon they had commercials out, they had the commercials out and on all the major advertising markets. So a good campaign, and on the whole, the economy hurt him. McCain could have been better if he'd have laid off of it, but he still would have lost.
I'll come back in a moment to some of the points you raised about Sarah Palin, but first of all, Jeff, let me get your take on that. Why do you think Obama won?
Well, I think it was, even though he's a little more wordy than Bill Clinton, it's the economy's stupid victory. And I think September the 15th, the day David's referring to, will go down as the day when everything flipped. So Lehman Brothers failed. McCain said that the fundamentals of the economy were strong, and it was all over. But in broader context, I think that there's a profound irony here, which is that Barack Obama came to national prominence because of his pristine anti-Iraq credentials, and that ended up being irrelevant. He couldn't win an election against Iraq because it played to McCain's strengths. It took up foreign policy and McCain's leadership, but also the surge, even the Democrats admit that the troop surge is now kind of working. So all that Obama momentum that got him through the primaries weren't going to carry him to the White House, and I think he understood that. But the second thing is there was a sort of middle election. If the first one was all this anti-Iraq, the middle one was a referendum on Barack Obama, the man, and he couldn't win that one either because he couldn't convince middle America that it was time to take a risk on this untested guy. Now, part of that was race, but I don't think it was all race. So he got bailed out by the oldest thing in American politics, which is you throw the bums out when the economy is in the tank. And, you know, we all talk about this rock star messiah, Barack Obama, but he won the election in a very old-fashioned way, I think.
So, given that all three of you are basically saying the economy was a gift to him, is what you're saying that pretty much any good Democrat candidate would have won? Had Hillary Clinton had the nomination, would we now be looking at President Clinton, Michael?
Yes. Yep. Yep. I don't think her margin would have been quite as big, but
she'd be
president.
She must be sitting at home.
Yeah.
To pick up on your point to do with Sarah Palin, some of the polling during the campaign showed that one of the key concerns people had about McCain was his age, and over time it emerged that what worried people most about her was her inexperience, and it seems to me that the marriage of those two things was absolutely toxic. How was it that McCain's advisors didn't see how those two things might work together?
Well, going into the convention, Senator McCain wanted to pick Senator Lieberman, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, as his mate, because that was the notion that would have proved the notion, this maverick notion. He was convinced by Steve Schmidt and the other people who ran the campaign, you can't do that because not only will there be a fight on the floor of the convention, there will be, you won't win. He cannot win. He won't get the nomination. They'll nominate someone else. You'll look like a fool. So he couldn't do that. And then he allegedly went to Governor Ridge of Pennsylvania and was told the same thing, that you cannot choose Ridge. He's pro-choice. You might get him through. but the nicely timed nature of the convention, you can't have a governed convention where you give the acceptance speech at 2 a.m. Both with those down, he was left with Mitt Romney, Governor Pawlenty of Minnesota, and Sarah Palin, and his campaign wanted him to pick Pawlenty, but sort of in shoot from the hip, he said, "You've stopped me twice," and he chose Sarah Palin.
Michael, do you think that it would have made any difference to McCain's campaign had he picked a different vice presidential nominee?
No. I don't think that there's any way that maybe any Republican was going to win after the collapse of the stock market.
Do you think that we've seen the last of Sarah Palin on the national political stage?
Well, journalists don't usually offer opinions, but I sure hope so.
That's not an answer to the question, of course.
I think she'd like to play. I think there are probably people who would like her to play, but I hope good sense takes root in the Republican councils.
I heard a gag during the week that she might be able to pick up work now as a Tina Fey impersonator. I want to talk a little bit more later about the Republican Party and where it goes from here, but for now let's stick big. The expectations surrounding Obama are exceedingly high in many corners of society and indeed around the world. Is it inevitable that he's going to disappoint, Jeff Garrett?
Well, I think there's an on the one hand, on the other hand. Just look at the three number one things that Obama will inherit, and you'd say the guy can't succeed. So he's got the worst economic downturn in 30 years. He's got a war on terrorism agenda that's probably going to expand, not contract, with Pakistan and Iran being added to Afghanistan and Iraq. And then we have President Medvedev saying that, that the US is the root of all evil, and I'm going to point some more missiles at them, so foreign policy isn't going away. And how's he going to deal with all those problems when before he spends a dime, he's staring at a $1 trillion annual budget deficit and more than $10 trillion in public debt? So all of that says there's no way, sky-high expectations, grim reality, Obama must fail. But I do think there's something to be said for the amount of political capital that Obama comes into office with. So take a look at it. His constituency in the US, the red states, blue states, there are many more blue states now in parts of the country where Democrats haven't been able to win for a generation, in the South and the Mountain West, in addition to this sort of Northeast industrial belt left coast coalition. So he's got a national coalition. He won extraordinarily broad-based support, including Latinos and Asian Americans who aren't necessarily part of the Democratic coalition. He's got bigger majorities in the House and the Senate. That's in the US. Then you go international. Every survey I've seen, including the one that we did at the US Study Center, says the world would have voted more than 4-1 for Obama. So you put all that political capital together and you say, sort of stir it up and say extraordinary times sometimes generate extraordinary leadership. Maybe this guy actually is an extraordinary leader. So I wouldn't rule success out, but obviously it would be naive to underestimate the magnitude of the challenges he's going to inherit.
Given the challenges that you outlined earlier in the answer, though, I'm wondering how long that political capital and goodwill will last.
Well, my feeling on this, and I'd be very interested in David and Michael's reactions, is that the first big key is going to be to see whether the Democratic Party becomes Barack Obama's party overnight, or whether he becomes captured by sort of pent-up demand on the Democratic side for middle-class rescue, as he's now calling it. I think Obama's predilections are probably pretty centrist, pretty pragmatic, and quite internationalist. But the Democratic Party, at least as it's represented in Congress, doesn't look like that. They're out for blood. They want redress not only of 8 years of Bush administration, but really 25 years since Reagan came to power. They want to reverse all of that. and the consequence is that they're likely to look a bit insular. So an early test will be whether Obama can rise above and lead the Democratic Party back to what many people might consider the sensible centre, or whether he's got to deliver on what he did in the campaign, which ended up being a pretty traditional left-leaning, domestic, close the doors to the outside world set of policies.
What do you think, Michael? Is Obama destined to fail because of the weight of expectations?
Gosh, I hope not.
And by that I mean, even if he's a good president, he may not live up to expectations.
Look, he comes into office at a time of great crisis, and we can take that Chinese ideograph of a crisis being danger and opportunity. The way Rahm Emanuel's chief of staff and John Podesta, who's been one of the co-chairs of his transition, have been talking, it's sees the crisis as an opportunity. Stories out of Chicago have him looking at a big bang approach to the economic crisis. I don't know what a big bang would be, but it suggests that he's looking at something that would continue the momentum, that would not let it peter out. Is he destined to fail? You know, editorial writers say on the one hand, on the other hand, and on the third hand. We always have a third hand in an editorial because that's what you want to argue for. And you want to argue that that seize the opportunity and get job number one done, which is the economy, because nothing's going to happen in international relations and foreign policy. Nothing's going to happen well without getting the economy right.
David, what do you think?
Well, of course he's going to fail in foreign policy. How could he possibly succeed? The world believes that peace will come upon us, the war will be over, he'll walk on water. That's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. And European and Australian, frankly, a couple of days here, your expectations are way too high. I view this as after 9/11, there was a certain American response to that, and place it over here. And then now you have a lot of people in the United States who believe that wasn't the right response, so they prefer something over here. Now you're going to get a calibration to what's the threat, real threat in the world. Because whether you're the Australian Prime Minister or the United States President, the same sources of intelligence come across the table. So now we're going to get a calibration about how dangerous the world is. And I think the policy, as Jeff just pointed out, we're going to be more involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. That doesn't strike me as though what a lot of people hope that we'd be out of those and it wouldn't be a problem. So I don't think he can possibly live up to expectations on the foreign policy front. On the domestic policy front, you get 2 years essentially, and then you're responsible for the economy. So when Ronald Reagan came in under pretty disastrous circumstances, really high inflation, high unemployment, highest misery index since the Depression, by the second year, in the year 1982, they lost 26 seats in the House, and well into the third year before the economic recovery started, Reagan was up at about 43% approval. So Obama has 2 years, and then the question is, I do believe they're going to have something like a $300 to $350 billion a plan, not a bailout plan, but a $350 billion stimulus package. And the question is, will it work? And if it works, then it'll be fine. But if it doesn't work, and there is some economic reasoning to believe that such stimulus plans generally turn to pork barrel and not into real job creation. But my view is he's got 2 years, and I think he will push the stimulus package. And that's perfectly legitimate. From economists on the right and left would agree that you have to put the stimulus package out. But the key for me will be, are they going to create real jobs, or are they going to build bridges to nowhere? And generally, politics, you build a lot of bridges to nowhere. So, but he's got 2 years, and at the end of 2 years, he'll be responsible for the state of the economy.
I want to talk about foreign policy and domestic issues as pretty much as you've just split it, but let's stick with foreign policy for now. There does seem to be an expectation that Obama will unwind straight away some of the more unpopular policies of the Bush administration, say, for example, Guantanamo Bay, and that Obama will close it. Isn't the reality that undoing some of those things is going to be very, very difficult?
There's two things that he can't. There's a set. My understanding is they're preparing. There are executive orders, presidential orders that can be done, and so on some of them they're preparing 200 of them. Among them are there's presently a ban on stem cell research that'll be lifted on January 21st. And in regard to Guantanamo, in regard to shutting it, some of the people who've been there a long time will be brought to trial in criminal trials, and others will be brought in the special court that was created for that. So I believe that at the executive order level, there'll be some things quickly done like that, but you're quite right. On the major foreign policy areas, presidents have more room to maneuver, but they still have to get stuff through Congress, and it's not clear that Afghanistan, to me, I understand why he had to talk about Afghanistan the way he did in the campaign, because as Jeff pointed out, the McCain's strength was in foreign policy, terrorism, protecting the country. So Obama couldn't look like he was too big a wuss, to use a technical term, and so the result was he had to say, well, the mistake was they went into Iraq. They should have gone in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, there have been a lot of countries that have been in Afghanistan many times, and you sort of add to Sunni Shia differences, you add Pashtun and tribal differences, and it strikes me that Afghanistan is not a particularly easy place to, seems to be easy to get into and pretty hard to get out of.
Yeah. It requires a political settlement in Afghanistan, not a military settlement. You want the military to keep things quiet while you do the politics, but in the end you have to do a political settlement.
The troop commanders there have been calling for additional ground forces for quite a while. Do you think that that will have to happen to enable there to be the conditions for a political settlement?
Probably yes. I mean, the ground commanders, I think, have the judgment to make that call, but it's not winnable militarily. And whether the Afghans want to keep Karzai, whether the Americans want to keep Karzai is quite an open question. He's proven ineffectual, and he's proven to be, well, so I say, at ease with corruption.
Jeff, do you expect President Obama will be asking more of Australia in terms of a contribution to Afghanistan?
My one-word answer would be yes, but let me give you what I think are the dominoes that lead to an Obama ask of Kevin Rudd for a bigger Australian commitment. The first one is just an observation about America, which is that in the US, it's been all Iraq all the time. The American public has no idea how big the mountain is in Afghanistan, and the more they understand that, I think the less there'll be public support for yet another war with no obvious exit strategy or strategy for winning. And couple that, of course, with the sheer exhaustion of the American military forces, plus the fact that I don't think anybody from President-elect Obama on down really believes that a Vietnam-style exit from the rooftops is in the cards in Iraq. So you keep some sizable force in Iraq into the medium term, call it 50,000 troops. You then ask the American public, can we take the 100,000 we had in Iraq and put them over here in Afghanistan? I think that'll be a hard ask. So then if you're President Obama, you say, wait a second, the world criticized the US for going into Iraq unilaterally, but the world, including Kevin Rudd, said that Afghanistan's the right war. So now it's surely time, as part of our coalition building, to go back to the Allies. My sense is that the continental European countries have no stomach for more Afghanistan. Canada has been torn apart by Afghanistan since the country has been there, since Canadian troops have been there, and Britain is in the midst of the sort of domestic political turmoil that I think makes more commitment to Afghanistan on a sort of Tony Blair level not plausible. Who does that leave? Among other countries, it leaves Australia, particularly when Kevin Rudd very cleverly, I think, for political reasons, got President Bush to say it's okay for Australia to be out of Iraq by saying that Afghanistan's the right war. So if you walk through all of that logic, I think it's almost inevitable that President Obama would come calling on President Rudd in Afghanistan. And I would imagine that, that Prime Minister Rudd would have to respond positively and then try to shade it a little bit. Maybe the big question for Australia would be, what would he get in return for that? For example, an Obama-led assault on a global environmental convention in Copenhagen next year.